George is a 77-year-old guy that walked into my office with a primary issue of, I can't keep up with my wife when we go for walks. My legs start to get really heavy, they start to get tired, and she's yelling at me to hurry it up, but I literally feel like they can't move. They feel like they're in sand. The feeling really starts in his butt and then starts to creep down the thighs. So the backs and the front of the thighs. They get heavy and it's like he can't really move them. They start to get crampy and numb, and then frankly, they start to get painful. Now, as soon as he sits down, it goes away immediately. But he really can't walk more than about 5 to 10 minutes without that feeling setting in. I did notice that he had a little bit of weakness in the ankle, which at this point I was suspicious of something called neurogenic claudication. Claudication refers to the crampy feeling that George was getting in the thighs. Neurogenic means that it's coming from the nerves. It's important to make this distinction because in a patient like George, who had had a heart attack a year ago, who had diabetes, so overall a guy who's not the healthiest guy, also at 77, he's no spring chicken, because there's another type of claudication called vascular claudication. This refers to cramping in the legs that happens because the blood vessels are hardened or stiff and they can't get the blood down to the muscles. The way you tell the difference between the two is, first of all, there are certain differences from the symptoms perspective, but the way that you try to tell a difference in the office is by testing for pulses in the feet. So I tested George's pulses and both of them were fine. So at this point, my suspicion that he had neurogenic claudication was pretty high. I recommended to George that we first get an MRI of his lumbar spine, so the lower part of the spine, to see if he had nerve compression or stenosis in that region. Here's what we found. Looking at George's spine, the nerves, which come down the central canal right here, we're getting pinched right here at what's called the L3-4 level. The nerves, they run down here, they're like strands of spaghetti. And what happens is, you can see right there, they kind of got bunched up. That's what those little squiggly lines are. Now, the reason George was getting this narrowing in the spinal canal, or spinal stenosis, was because he had degeneration in his spine. When the spine starts to degenerate, which is when the spine develops arthritis, degeneration, similar kind of thing. What happens is there's this connective tissue in the back that tends to hypertrophy or grow. This is called ligamentum. But the thing is that when the ligamentum's growing, it grows on top of the nerve roots and it causes pressure on the nerve roots. So as the space for those nerve roots narrow, that's called spinal stenosis. And when spinal stenosis gets bad enough, it can start to cause the symptoms that George was having. This constellation of pain, numbness, tingling in the legs that we refer to as neurogenic claudication. We also had gotten x-rays. Now, x-rays are something that we get on every patient that we're considering for spine surgery because we want to look at their alignment. For George, I saw that he had something called a degenerative scoliosis. Now, what this is when the spine degenerates in an asymmetric fashion. So instead of degenerating, evenly one on top of the other, his was degenerating in a way that was causing a curve or a scoliosis in the spine. This is different than a lot of scoliosis you hear about, like adolescent scoliosis, because this happens to people as they age. It probably wasn't something that George was born with. This complicated the situation a little bit because the surgery that I thought would be helpful for George was something called a decompression or a laminectomy. He had tried physical therapy, epidural injections, medications like gabapentin at this point, none of which were really giving him the relief that he needed. So I thought he needed a surgery to create more space for those nerve roots. So the kind of surgery that I recommended was something called a lumbar decompression or a laminectomy. Now in George's case, because of the scoliosis, this made things a little more complicated because if you do a laminectomy or a decompression in somebody with scoliosis, sometimes the scoliosis gets worse. Not necessarily because of the surgery, it may just be that it was always going to get worse. And then they may get to the point that they need a fusion. So I counseled George about this possibility that even though we may do a laminectomy or decompression now, he may still need the fusion down the line. I also thought it was good to start with something smaller for George, considering his age, considering his history of heart disease, and considering his diabetes. We did the decompression, we did the lumbar decompression. He left the hospital the next day. He was having near complete relief of his symptoms by around 6 weeks. He's now 2 years after the surgery and he's doing much better. His wife is still yelling at him to keep up though.